Hello, everyone. Yes, I don't know if 3 is still a level of naivete that makes it work, but it's true. I remember very well that time. I was also trying to breastfeed, so just before going on stage and everything, and I was like, why do we do this? What's the thing behind moms? And I just wanted to, through the topic of gender equity and what does it mean, women leadership, and how do we help create a larger movement of women entrepreneurs around the world, I wanted to share maybe with you my more personal story around what gender equity means to me, and then how I try to translate that within our organization and disseminate it within our community so that I could try at least to have a proactive action when we talked about women and leadership and gender equity. So quickly about myself, where should I point so that it moves? So how my professional journey started, I was actually selling very expensive lipstick at L'Oreal, and quickly into my corporate career, I realized that maybe this is not what I wanted to be doing. And so I went in 2013 with my partner for the first world tour of Seedstars. But I think one of the aha moments when I made that shift was, I don't know if you know the blog Wait the Why, and it's this really funny, interesting way of him illustrating life, and he was able to fit all the weeks of one life in one slide. And so that kind of freaked me out, because it was like, okay, I'm not sure I know consciously how I want to be doing the next weeks in my life. And so took our backpack, we went from beautiful postcard Switzerland to a more chaotic reality, which was trying to identify who were the entrepreneurs around the world, and not in the usual suspect ecosystems, but here, for example, the streets of Lagos, the largest city in Nigeria, and figuring out what were their gaps, what were the inefficiencies, and how could we participate in that journey. So Seedstars has a mission to impact people's lives in emerging markets, knowing we were at a sweet spot of the rises of emerging markets, technology really democratizing, and a movement, a global one. It wasn't the developed countries construct. It was a global movement of a generation that saw entrepreneurship as an opportunity. Of course, in many ecosystems, and you know that better, it is still of necessity, but very much also movement as a true career path for different people. So now we're exposed in 90 markets, from our global startup competition, but to on-the-ground programs, and to, of course, our investments. So we really push to build the entrepreneurial education programs, schools now that we're launching in these markets, investing as a VC, so venture capital fund, early stakes in equity in these companies around the world, and continuing to build the community, as we've seen in the GEM report, being, of course, that element of building the role models, or building the ecosystem and the network needed so that these companies can scale. We, of course, and this is the simplified version of our theory of change, which is the impact framework that we use, but trying to identify what are the correct activities so we that can get to that mission, but also within that having indicators consciously related to gender equity, and asking ourselves, how can we push forward the agenda on this subject? So when thinking of women leadership, in many ways, for me, I had to start with myself. What were my own biases and how was I approaching it? And I think, unfortunately, in many ways, because I come from, compared to the ecosystem of women entrepreneurs around the world, from a very privileged background. So I think the biases hit hard for me when I became a mother, because I was suddenly confronted to the fact that there was not an infrastructure or support system, or even kind of a support group around this. So just to share with you some of the biases, I remember very well in the early years of Seedstars, when women entrepreneurs would come to me and ask me, okay, like, venture capitalism is this kind of male-driven industry. Like, I don't do pitches on stage in 2 minutes format, trying to build them the case that I'll be the next unicorn. It's not me. And I remember the best advice I could give was learn how to pitch like a man. And that was kind of today we're far from that, because a lot of people have understood that if you wanted to identify those kind of raw talents and these interesting businesses around the world, you couldn't operate in the same fashion, because you were missing out on a whole community of enterprises. But I remember in that transition phase, it was like, I know that's not a good answer, but that's the best I can give you now so that you can actually get yourself exposed to this VC industry because you need funding and we need to be able to support you. And there's this really interesting TED Talk where Dana was able to kind of expose how we are consistently biased towards how we approach the pitch of a woman versus the pitch of a man. And it fundamentally comes down to we ask men to win and we ask women not to lose, which is counterintuitive, especially from my world doing investment where we want to like bet. So it's kind of more of a gambling approach on this big win because it has to work with our investment thesis of trying to get a unicorn within our investment portfolio. And I suddenly realized in the semantic of how I was speaking in business, I was completely biased to defavor women. I mean, I was someone still saying for a long time, when I wasn't happy with the performance of my team, for example, I would say, man up. I was the first to use this jargon that I had been accustomed to and hadn't even identified that within that there was a big bias and I wasn't helping out the cause. Another element is the imposter syndrome. I had to be very brutally honest with myself that I have it and I have it heavily. And society doesn't help me with that, I think, in many ways. And I think Michelle Obama really changed the game for me because for a long time I was relating my imposter syndrome to my hormones or to my personality. So it's kind of, I'm kind of born with it. It's me. I'm a bit more, fragile, uncertain, not comfortable if I'm getting opportunities. And Michelle Obama did this great speech where she's saying for minorities, which is, it's not just about gender, it's for minorities in general, because you've been told that you are not good enough, you feel like an imposter. So suddenly what I felt was something probably part of my genetics became external factors that kind of had been imposed in me. And so I grew up in a way where systematically when something came for me, the first thing I would go is, do they know that I don't know? Or it was kind of that I'm not competent enough, or how do I approach this? And I would see this again and again in talents within Seedstars or friends and that were minorities within their context and their society and kind of undervalued them. And at the same, those more privileged within their communities, I felt were over-evaluating themselves too many times. I mean, now that I'm fortunate also to participate in boardrooms of different companies, I can assure you there are way too many people that should not be at that table. And they tend to look all the same. So I think identifying that imposter syndrome allowed me to consciously react on how would we, of course, try to figure out how I would manage that, but also how I could understand that from others with their personal story and context. Another element was don't be shy. I preferred not to show myself relating to the imposter syndrome, but the reality is success breeds success in the sense that role models is probably for me still one of the more crucial elements in creating a movement of getting more people involved. I have been inspired to act because of women that have spoken up, that have publicly put themselves out there in different manners. Everyone has their own channel to communicate, but that's something, again, that I also consciously acted on to be visible and public on certain subjects, because it does help to push the next generation to feel like it's okay to get involved and move, and they will have their next steps. I remember Bilan had contacted me at the very early stages of Seedstars to be on the cover of their magazine. And as much as I was very flattered, I couldn't believe I was the top of the list. And the reality was every other woman had said no. And that's a problem. And trust me, I've had a lot of backlash on this cover. It's not the best necessarily, but I think putting us out there and not being shy, finding the channel, the way that makes you feel comfortable to talk about it is extremely important in building this revolution of gender equity and women in leadership. And last, maybe on my personal story, is motherhood. Now that I'm 3 kids in, what I realize is that I think I can judge the leadership of an organization on how they have been able to manage the hardships of their talents. Motherhood for me was a hardship. And today I can say that I'm stronger, but because I have survived the process, I'm still in it in many ways, but I think that was really crucial revelation for me. It's not about saying it's okay to have mothers or whatsoever. And it is not, I think, an asset to be a mother when you don't have the support of the organization to get through. In the contrary, you back down because that's how hard it is. So like anyone that has lived, all of you have your personal hardships. You yourself believe that these hardships have become your assets because you have been able to go through them, live through them. And that's how I try to see also leadership now. It's as best as how you've been able to support the hardships, which again, motherhood being one, but there are so many others. So how did we see this within Seedstars? It really comes down to diversity, inclusivity, and belonging. Diversity for us was easy. We wanted to be global from day one. We wanted to be remote from day one. So having a diverse group of people being part of our adventure was an easy thing. So I can't take much credit for that. Inclusivity has been the battle and the work we've done for the past year as we professionalize ourselves, which was how do we make sure they're included? And two big fundamental works have been done with us is build transparency. So figure out throughout your whole value chain from the moment you hire someone, retain, to let them go within the organization, what are the biases, and try to attack one by one the topics. It went from changing the semantics to our job descriptions, rethinking the sourcing funnel of our talents. Recently, we did a rigorous process of hiring an investment manager, and we found ourselves in conversations saying, okay, guys, we're right now talking about this woman where we think that she is too aggressive. Let's change the narrative. We have a man in front of us. Would we ever use that as potentially a negative element for recruitment of this talent? So try to push ourselves in how we reflect on including these talents. And second, training our managers, not training them to not do what needs, like to do what's not possible. So please don't to speak like this, present yourself like this, don't think like this. If not, you're not being inclusive. But the best thing we thought was show them, prove them that in order to operate in a diverse setting, which we think will be our winning recipe, you need to understand how to leverage these differences and be more effective. And for that, ultimately, it comes down to listening, putting in place processes that can be customized enough to the needs of everyone because no one wants the same thing. And of course, some more concrete policies of when it goes from maternity leave to paternity leave and all these other conversations. But the really, really tough part, which to be honest, we're still in the makings and it will be our lifetime journey, is belonging. It's really tough to have everyone feel like they belong enough that they can be themselves and outperform themselves when I think it as an organization. And so that's for us constantly at best, putting in place an agile organization that's strong in experimentation, and we constantly experiment until the experiment is good enough for a time period that suddenly it becomes has been, and we have to rethink the model again. And that's kind of how we've approached this. Finally, at an organization level, when we think of, okay, it's one thing that I've rethought my personal biases, how I work with my team in the organization, but now how can we be a proactive ambassador on the question of gender equity? And for me, what's most important is setting targets. If not, you get very quickly confused. So again, in that concept of experimentation, we've been trying to proactively be part of this community, trying to address these subjects. So it started as we were professionalizing ourselves in 2019 with IFC. We built a list of experiments within our startup competition where we had the biggest exposure globally of building experiments where we could get more women participations from the application to the due diligence phase to the investment phase. And it works. The very stupid things like actually, if you want more women, you actually need to put women in when you do call for application. simply because they feel identified more, and so more people, the referral rate is higher. So we increased by 6 times the number of women applications, for example. Or then in 2020 with UN Women Care and different partners in Asia, we launched a program for women-led startups or startups that were tackling directly women-related services. So very much in the care industry, for example. And here it was giving them that framework of having an impact theory of change and figuring out how we could better help them get more women as they scaled. And that again increased. Or we worked with GIZ now supporting 100 women-led SMEs and figuring out, okay, how do we get them faster to investment readiness? And again, there's some easier tasks, like you need more women role models, hence more women mentors, hence more women LPs. So how do you think of getting more women LPs in the equation so that they actually can be a real voice in the investment committees? And now to launching schools. So we just launched in Ivory School, our first entrepreneurial coding school for 150 women, and something that we hope to scale in other regions. And it's mothers from 16, not mothers from 16, but women from 16 to 52 participating. And there's a lot that we have to do. One, this is during the boot camp, so it's 1 month, it's intense, another level of resilience there. And there's still a long way to go in figuring out how we can really give them the whole support so that they can focus on upskilling, reskilling, or just their career, or just launching their first venture. And finally, on the investment side, we signed the 2X challenge with the other DFIs and global investors around the world, where we have 50-50 gender equity from the analysts within the fund to the GP, the general partner, the investment manager of the fund, and targeting our portfolio to 30% to women-led businesses. And that's something we continue and do. And some of the rising stars in the portfolio, we have Daria from Study Free in Russia, which provides tens of thousands of students access to higher education abroad. We have Pesesha with Hilda, or even Halima that launched Oran, which are both fintech startups providing SME loans and now entrepreneurial loans. And with the case of Halima, she has really specifically focused her target customers being women, and figuring out what's the right model to tailor to these types of customers. So maybe just to end, for me, the common denominator is in all of this is that we need quite a big level of courage. And these women are extremely courageous in their approach of trying to tackle these questions of gender equity and being the example of what women leadership look like. So I want to end with the quote of Eleanor Roosevelt, which has been one of my biggest role models. I've called my daughter Eleanor due to that. And I think the main reason why I left my corporate experience was when I came across this quote, I was terrified to see how comfortable I was. So that was kind of my first leap of fear, was to quit that job. But what's even more beautiful is afterwards, what she says is do one thing every day that scares you, because it is those small things that make us uncomfortable, help build the courage needed to do the work that we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alisée, for this kind of inspiration. We have the next, even a role model, Amanda. Amanda, you know, on one hand, researcher at Paxton College, but even I saw you being here as an entrepreneur. I think this kind of combination is really, even for our school, a role model, how we can do it both, you know, practice and, let's say, theory. Amanda, the floor is yours about highlights in relation to Women Entrepreneurship Report.
Get hooked up here.
There you go.
Here. It's there. Okay. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to share some of the results from the previous year's report on entrepreneurship. Gender differences globally.
Here we go.
You ready? Okay. So I'm going to move swiftly because we're a little tight on time and I want to make sure we have a lot of time for discussion. Is often the best part, right? So
I'm just going to share a few slides to give you a few highlights. This report was enormous. Aileen, I think, is going to crack the whip and make sure it's not so long next time. But it's rich with data. It's a lot like what Steve Hill talked about, right? That as academics, we're in the weeds. There's so many stories to tell, and somehow we have to sort of, cull the very best of them. So I'm going to try to make this brief. But when we look at startup rates by gender and country and the level of national income, I think, what I want you to see in this chart is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. In fact, there are actually a few countries in the 2021 data where women actually were starting businesses at higher rates. For example, in the Dominican Republic, Morocco, and I think there's another one in there too, in Kazakhstan, where women are vibrantly active. So in this context, with lots of heterogeneity across country, it can be very difficult to draw conclusions. At a global level, we also have different countries participating every year. So it's really important for the country teams to look at gender in your country and really help us understand what's happening in those contexts. There we go. Okay. Oops. Is it you or me?
I think you.
Okay. All right, COVID impacts. Everyone wants to know about COVID impacts. So women were hit really hard in the startup phase and in established businesses. Those impacts were felt most dramatically in lower income countries. And in upper middle income countries, we actually saw, and this is using the World Bank classifications, not what they've done in the global report where they've come up with new categories for national income level. But I think it's really important to understand that what's happening at each of these levels of national income is quite different. In the upper middle income countries are where we see women starting businesses and growing quite large businesses, as well as in upper income countries. But when we look at the exit rates, pandemic impacts, and we look at the reasons for closure, when we see pandemic impact as the orange there, you'll see that it was actually the women. There's a lot of volatility in those upper middle income countries. So the women in the upper middle income countries were the most likely to report closing a business due to the pandemic in 2021. You'll also notice that family reasons is actually the biggest problem for women in low-income countries. Now, we don't have a lot of low-income countries in this data set, but from the countries we are measuring, this is where we see some of the biggest family impacts. And of course, these are also countries where you don't have a lot of public support for family. Importantly, you'll notice that the blue category, not profitable, this is the #1 reasons the businesses exit around the world. So I think it's really important because we put a lot of weight on lack of financing, but the lack of financing, we see a fair amount of heterogeneity. It's women in the lowest income countries that close businesses because they can't get enough financing to move it forward. And you can see in the high income countries, the trends show that women are slightly more likely to cite financing as a reason for closure. Digital, we're all really interested in digital. Women are overrepresented among the smallest businesses where it can be very costly to go to digitization, and across levels of national income. We also see some very clear patterns here. You'll notice that here we're looking at TEA and established businesses, so the startups and the businesses over 3.5 years old, and that women in low income countries were much more likely than men to deploy digital. And of course, that requires access to mobile technology, access to the internet, access to recharging your mobile phones if you happen to have them. And we're seeing some big gains in terms of closing the digital gap in many of these economies. So this is huge, and this matters a lot. Data from the US and Europe show that that digitization actually offset the losses of the pandemic, reduce the impact on revenue much more significantly for women-owned businesses. Again, they tend to be smaller, right? And so the report digs into this a little bit more, but we also see that, women in lower income countries were also the most likely to have plans in the future for more digital tool use. to improve their business. So this is a trend that we would like to see encouraged. One of the values of the GEM methodology, we talked earlier, attitudes, it also measures the informal economy, but it also provides sort of a life cycle view. It's a snapshot cross-sectional, but it still gives us kind of an idea of what we're looking at. And this becomes really important for women's entrepreneurship, especially in regions like the Middle East and Africa, where intentions, the blue bars, are extremely high. And for women and for men, but for women in particular, they have a much harder time translating intentions into actual startup activity and then translating the startups into established businesses where women tend to have lower rates and participation than men. So I think that this is a really important perspective. Okay. All right, and then I think one of the things we're really trying to show with the women's report is that we need to change the narrative around women's entrepreneurship globally. For a long time, the story has been women are trailing men, again this year, women are trailing men. But there's a lot more to the story. And here I refer back to, Stephen's perspective point that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the data. Well, with women are overrepresented among the most vulnerable, smallest businesses in the world, but they're also making extremely important contributions to their families, their communities, and societies through high potential businesses. And in the European data, you can see this well represented. We look at measures like how many jobs are you looking to create in the next 5 years? We look at how innovative is your offering? Is your offering product or service new to your community? And how active are you in exports? And you can see here that in many countries, women are operating at parity with men on these factors. So that would be 1 out of 2. Globally, women represent 1 out of 3 of high growth businesses. And I'm basing that primarily on our expecting to hire measure. But you can see they're even more active in Europe in innovative entrepreneurship and very active in exports in many countries as well. This is a policy message that we really need to get through to governments around the world. Investing in women matters. If you have 3 kids, you're not going to not invest in one of them. You're going to invest in all 3 of them, right? So we have to be cautious around the stereotype that women aren't good at business, that women are running the smallest businesses, that women's businesses don't grow, because it's simply not true, right? So high potential. And then industry composition. We talk a lot about cultural factors. GEM data is fantastic at introducing perceptions and attitudes. They tend to be pretty stable year to year, and cultural attitudes matter a lot, but we mustn't forget that structural factors like industry composition, where these key individuals are starting businesses, matter a lot for how large the business grows, how profitable it is, what the exits might look like. And so women, again, they tend to be overrepresented in industry sectors where there are low barriers to startup, but very competitive, and a lot more volatility. And this is particularly true in regions like Latin America, right? And so I think it's really important to pay attention to the industry. And I will say on financing, this is really critical. The global venture capital data suggests that over 60% of the venture capital is going to software, not just ICT, but software. Women are heavily underrepresented in startups and established businesses in this sector. And that's one of the most important reasons why women are getting this tiny minority of venture capital. And so I think that's really important to understand. It's also really important that we start directing capital to sectors where women are participating, and especially with regard to the SDGs. For example, the energy sector. We know that investing in women brings energy to households, but very little capital goes into advancing those businesses. Women are also more likely to have solo businesses, sole proprietorships around the world. It's particularly a strong trend in the high-income countries, and not so much in low-income countries. And so when we're looking at developing context, what's happening there, right? Small market economies, a lot of informal business. Women are most active in high income countries also at growing really big businesses, 20 people or more. And think about that. So businesses less than 3.5 years old that already have 20 employees or more. Right. And those are the businesses most likely to hire more people. All right. One of the things we have not looked a lot in GEM is actually household income. And there's some very interesting gender trends by household income. So we look at, class, race, and gender. We look at immigrant status. We're looking at age. We're looking at these different social categories. And I think here's another category that we should all spend more time looking at. You'll notice that the biggest gender gaps there are in low-income countries. It's actually women in middle-income category that are most likely to be active in starting businesses, whereas in upper middle-income countries and high-income countries, it's men in the top income household income bracket. So what's going on there? How can we understand that better? Enabling environment. I think this is one of the most important findings in last year's report, and that is for the second time in the National Expert Survey, we asked a set of questions specifically about gender supports, support for women in the economy. And so I just want to say, national experts around the world pretty much have a dim view on how well their economies support women, whether we're looking at equal cultural support for women entrepreneurs, looking at favorable regulations for women entrepreneurs, if we're looking at sufficient family support services, those were where they were the most negative. Are we really surprised that when women go to start businesses or grow businesses, that they are taking an approach where they think the cards are stacked against them, right? It turns out the experts agree. So if women have lower confidence, how much of that is female psychology and how much of that is just the reality? They're reading the environment actually quite well, right? And so these are areas where I think we can go in and we can make a big difference in terms of our recommendations. We need to support the high potential women entrepreneurs. We need to tell their stories, celebrate the successes of these successful women. We need to mobilize financing and support to women in sectors where they don't receive a lot of capital. And we, again, need to recognize the importance that business types, markets, and industry sectors, these structural factors, are a really important place to focus policy work, as in COVID. There were certain sectors that required a lot more support than others. And I'll just kind of leave with this note that in the US, we had a lot of economic relief, but one of the relief programs was the SBA Emergency Injury Disaster Loan Program. There was $390 billion that went to companies with 90% of the companies that took that funding, so took on debt relief that will not be forgiven. 90% of those companies had 10 employees or fewer. And I'm going to guess that a majority of those companies are led by women. And so when we're looking at policy interventions, what do we do for the people whose personal finances were devastated by the COVID, who are just starting businesses when it happened, lost everything, right? And what are we going to do about the companies where they've incurred all this debt? Where I think women are probably overrepresented. And I will close there. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, for this insight into the new report. I think we saw a lot of facts and figures in this way, and you could go probably a little bit deeper in with two insights. We heard before about Morocco. It seems to be quite a, let's say, an interesting movement, and I'd like to give the floor to Fatem about it. Yeah.
Well, we noticed in 2021 a little increase of dynamic entrepreneurship in nascent, concerning nascent entrepreneurs. But in overall, I think that women entrepreneurship is of particular relevance in all the region of MENA. We have a total of population in the MENA about 425 million, and the MENA regions needs to achieve a sustainable model of growth, and this implies meeting a major challenge. Increasing participation of women in the labor markets. We have, particularly in Morocco, we have 8 women in 10 that are inactive. So this is a dramatical reality. In all the region of MENA, we have about 26% of rate of participation in the job market. So, well, if women's participation in the labor markets in the MENA increases as equal as men, this is mean that the regional GDP will be added about 46%. So it will rise to by 46%. So it will be incredible, and it means that all the MENA region will realize about $600 billion of added annual economic impact. So, so these figures are too large and significant to be ignored. In the gender reports in 2021, some of the most important trends in the women entrepreneurship were founded in the region of MENA, where entrepreneurial intention were extremely high in contrast to very low startup. This region also showed the highest rates of digital technology uses prompted by the pandemic, and it was a question about this in the first panel. So there is there is a clear need to unlock the region's potential and to enact economic and social policies that create long-term sustainable and inclusive economic growth for countries in the Middle East of Africa. And well, to conclude and to be in the, well, I appreciated really your intervention. I think there is, we need to change the paradigm. We need to adopt a new research agenda to highlight this difference, the cultural, the special embeddedness of women entrepreneurship. We need to deconstruct the monolithic figure of women to highlight the fragmented and heterogeneous realities of women. By neglecting differences in favor of presumption of universality of the stature of women, certain categories of women and certain regions of the world have been largely marginalized by research in entrepreneurship and gender studies. Thanks.
Thank you, Fatem. Yes, Mahsa, your point of view.
Yes, well, there is an ecosystem for women entrepreneurs. In the National Expert Survey, we have an entrepreneurial ecosystem conditions from the national expert. In 2021, we have an entrepreneurial ecosystem for women entrepreneurs in additional 6 questions. As an example, I want to read exactly from the questionnaire. In my country, the national culture encourages or motivates women as equally as men to become entrepreneur or run a business. Another example is that in my country, access to financing is equally granted, not only men, but also women entrepreneurs, and so forth. From APS, we reported gender gap is hardly narrowing between men and women. I'm originally from Iran, where ecosystem is strong, actually weak. And I'm doing my study in Norway and Spain, where ecosystem for women entrepreneur is strong. In this society that I said ecosystem is strong, it will help to reduce this gender gap. Another example is that ecosystem in a society, as I said, is strong, will boost women entrepreneurial entry, intention to become an entrepreneur among women. We know that when pandemic happened around the world, all entrepreneurs, most of the entrepreneurs and businesses was disrupted, not only men, but also women. And we know that about the gender role, the men as a breadwinner role and the women as a caretaker. During the pandemic, this role among women entrepreneurs was more highlighted. However, in a society, ecosystem is strong, it will reduce women entrepreneurial exit. After the pandemic, you know, in principle, during the resilience time, most of the entrepreneurs who exited, they tried to back to the business, entrepreneurial life, I mean. However, ecosystem in a society which is actually very strong will help to boost or increase women entrepreneurial re-entry. As a conclusion, I want to say that this ecosystem for women entrepreneurs is important. As Armando mentioned, one of the recommendations, as you mentioned, we need support high potential women entrepreneurs. So I want to point out ecosystem for women entrepreneurs in a society where it's high will increase women entrepreneurial entry or women entrepreneurial re-entry to the entrepreneurial life, I mean. And in this society, women entrepreneurial will be actually, it will help women entrepreneurial exit to reduce this actually situation that happened during the crisis. We say that about the pandemic, and right now we're having another crisis for Ecuador, to help them to back to stay at the entrepreneurial life. I think that is one of the important highlighted points, and also actually Ernesto mentioned, we have to point out. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mahsa. Yes, a clear ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's a challenge, you know, and for ecosystem, it's not only important for policymakers, you know, we even need all, you know, we even need private companies like Cartier, Women Initiative, you know, I saw it quite impressive what they're doing for impact on the woman impact entrepreneurs. How now you see reflect, you know, seeing this kind of data, you know, in relation to your initiative?
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed. You know, I think that one of my key takeaways today in learning about the 176,000 surveys that all of you collect on our behalf to inform our work is that for sure, don't just talk to policymakers, talk to us also. You know, us as corporates, we have important responsibility in supporting entrepreneurship to create the change that we all want to see. And if we, as corporates, believe that business is an important force for good, it's not just big businesses, it's also all the new and starting businesses. At the Cartier Women Initiative, I and the team have the privilege of supporting and running a woman impact entrepreneurship program that is supporting women who are creating businesses that are creating social and environmental change. And just as Fatem said, you know, an ecosystem is so important, and we are a community of 700 around the world that is trying to support women impact entrepreneurs. And we have 300 women impact entrepreneurs who are high potential impact entrepreneurs, exactly as how Amanda described. And we are trying to leverage them to create and change the narrative of what people see as a woman leader is. And just as what you have just described, it's not just what our achievement is, it's also what we survived, right? In the process of becoming an entrepreneur as a woman, you know, you see the achievement on the paper, the number of staff you've hired, the revenue, the products and services that you've delivered. But the journey of getting there as a woman, it's a little bit different as a man. And so, and this for sure touches on the different points in life when a woman decided to start a business, rather it is when she graduated from college and she realized, oh, I'm one of the field girls who's starting a business. Or when they become a mom and realize, wow, there's like 10,000 business ideas that needs to be started because as a mom, I need these products and services for my kids, for my family. or as a woman, as a main caretaker for a family, as they age and they're taking care of their elderly parents of terminal illness. And they again realize, wow, more business ideas are missing in the world. And that doesn't even include the women that are in this as serial entrepreneurs and have all along actually had the entrepreneurship bug, just like men. And so for us, we really have this incredible opportunity to support this great population of people who are looking to change the world. And so I hope that you all know that all of your work is so important to all of us at Cartier. And I hope you encourage other corporates to also create programs that support entrepreneurship, and that we have a chance to join forces with all of you, as well as policymakers, to see the change that we want to see.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think it's an important message, you know. Alisée, what now you think about it? You know, this is kind of data, you know, more from a data perspective for
sure.
what you're doing, you know.
I think it was a bit reassuring because I felt like some of our actions that we took in a more opportunistic way initially resonates with what the data is saying in terms of the recommendations. And it's true, our thesis was, if we do want to talk about just having a disproportionate impact, let's try and target, support, and invest in those high potential women, because it can have this multiplier effect, which would be extremely powerful in these ecosystems. So very reassuring, always very much impressed to see what's going on, and voila.
I did ask Amanda to let's say at the end to do a short resume before the Q&As. What now, let's say from your now perspective, Amanda, the key outcomes for you?
Well, I think that, you know, and I'm reflecting on the panel here. But I think what I hear is the panel echoing a lot of what I presented, which is, let's pay more attention to the ecosystem. Let's change the narrative around women's entrepreneurship. You know, if we focus on women entrepreneurs as disadvantaged, it isn't going to help the women who are starting and growing businesses, because they're going to come into it expecting problems. So a little self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So I really think we do need to shift the narrative. I think, you know, I'm also hearing certainly from our researchers on the panel that there are some exciting things happening, not just challenges, but also some exciting progress and responses to those challenges, certainly in the Middle East and African countries. I think that from our entrepreneurial support organization representatives here in the panel, I think you know that these programs, Seedstars and CWI, are supporting women who are bringing solutions to their communities and to their economies, and powering those solutions, again, in sectors where there often isn't a lot of investment. So mobilizing capital, directing it to places where we really need a lot of social interventions, where we need social impact, I think is incredibly important. And this builds on the strengths of women entrepreneurs. And Jem has spoken to this for a long time now. You know, women have a tendency to prioritize social impact over economic or wealth creation, right? Economic impact of their businesses. It's in their mindsets when they start the businesses. In part, this is again reflected by the industry sectors in which they're starting those businesses. And but that can also vary by country. So there are some countries where even women are much more likely than women in other countries to focus on creating economic value. You know, this narrative continues. I think we also see growing evidence in advanced economies where men are focused on social impact as well. So I think we're all on the same page here, and I like that Wingee really pointed out that it isn't just policymakers that we're actually generating this data for. That's actually for the organizations who are out there working on the front lines to better support women entrepreneurs that need the evidence base that we're producing. So again, I'm just going to say, so excited to see all the country teams here, and I hope in your own countries, your own economies, that you can flip the narrative, and generate some of the data that's really needed to produce better policy and to support better programming for women entrepreneurs.
It's just an open question to all researchers in the room. As we have been more loud on gender equity, what I have gone in response, and I haven't seen a lot of data around it, is a lot of men. There are a lot of questions we need to be asking the men. For example, at Seedstars, the moment we really made it safe to take a paternity leave, because there's one thing to formally provide it, it's another in the informal culture if it's really accepted or not. Most men took it. I mean, and so it'd be interesting to ask men their interest and involvement in gender equity, because they have been put in a box their whole life and they actually want to be more impact driven, but it wasn't accepted, or the rules of the game in their market was that they had to operate in a certain fashion in terms of their leadership approach, their approach to caregive, like caretakers, and how they involve them in and so I don't know if it is a reflection or something to approach, but I think there's a lot of information we could get from the men in better understanding gender equity, because they also have been stereotyped in a manner that doesn't fit their whole self. If I don't know if it's clear, but I wasn't able to answer with data until now.
Yeah,
I'll follow up on that really briefly. I do think this is important. And for those of you who have done a lot of work in gender and business, you'll know that when we're looking at startups and growing businesses, that the businesses we pay the least attention to are the ones that are jointly owned by men and women. And by the way, those team-driven businesses are often very high-performing businesses. And so we have to be careful about that dichotomy, right, between male-owned and led or women-owned and led, because I think there's a lot of great work happening jointly. We really are all in this together, and so I really appreciate, let me say, your comment on that. You'll notice from the data I presented that men were also reporting family reasons as a reason for closing a business, right? So the differences, the gender differences that we see, often the differences can be quite small. And when we're dealing with 176,000 respondents, everything looks significant if we're running significant tests. And so even very small differences. So I think, again, we come back to the idea of heterogeneity. We also need to pay attention when we're talking about difference, about how large those differences really are, because I think there's much more overlap, much more in common between men and women entrepreneurs than there are differences between them. And I will leave that there.
we have time for some questions. We are doing a short lunch break. It's so complex, question, to the panel.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for a good panel. I'm wondering to whom I should direct this question, but I'm going to ask you to jump in and tell me if this particular question is relevant to you. It has been said, especially in businesses which are on the technology side, that women have sort of a built-in problem in three areas. A disadvantage, you can say. One is that women have less accessibility to finance, and I think this has been addressed already. They have less accessibility to relevant social networking, and that, which is interesting, there is less of accessibility to intellectual property that may be the basis for a new business. I wonder which one of you would like to relate to these particular insights. Thank you.
Or actually, it is so interesting because in our program work, we have one program category that's focused on deep tech entrepreneurs. And specifically there, it's women who are doing technological and scientific innovation versus our other program categories are more business model innovation. And amongst the women entrepreneurs in that program, Indeed, access to finance, the network, and also the IP strategy is one where they ask for the most support. And but it's not because the woman herself is not talented. It's actually because her access to these resources are less. And so for us as a program, entrepreneur support organization, we have partnered with Hello Tomorrow, which is another great organization and ecosystem that is also supporting impact entrepreneurs in deep tech and working with them to channel more of these type of resources to the deep tech women entrepreneurs. And they have done incredible work. Like the number of applications we receive for that category every year is around 200 to 300, and we select 3 women. And so there's no shortage of these women in deep tech who should qualify for great finance and also access to network and IP support. And we have to start, and that's why I think our role exists, right? We need to provide them these support to help remove these barriers for them so that they can be the next generation of deep tech entrepreneurs for the next generation.
And I'll speak to that too, as a CEO, co-founder of a medical diagnostics company, and I'm in my second raise process right now, and working with partnering negotiations. The network part of it is very real. If anyone in this room who's ever gone out to raise investment financing, you'll know that the way you secure the initial introduction is through warm introductions, right? By knowing people who know people. and that can be harder for women for the simple reason that there aren't as many women on the investment side, right? We're not well represented there. And it's just how we organize the world. Every society to some degree is organized along gender lines. And so I'll say with the younger generation, that is changing. But it's still a big challenge. And I think the peer networking and the mentoring through programs like CWI and Seedstars is really transforming that for a lot of women founders out there.
So we try to move away from gender per se. It's really a minority issue. Because I've been in positions where I've pushed my gender inequalities, and I have men from socioeconomic backgrounds that feel much more at a disadvantage to me. So I think adding the socioeconomic is fundamental in any of this conversation. But when we look at the minorities, those 3 elements are obvious that because coming back from how society is constructed and who is privileged to have access to the network, to the education, to the financing, which is very much a closed community. Okay, it's very much in a referral system, and even more so in BC, where it's really kind of building up on the FOMO, and so how you speak that jargon, etc. So I think it's something that we have to break down and okay, as an investor, it is in my best interest to break down these biases so that I can identify investment opportunities at an interesting cost. And to do that, the bias of only depending on my referral system on people that are like me so that I feel like I better understand so I can invest is to my disadvantage on performance. So I think the more people understand that it's a performance-driven approach to take away biases, to build in a process of transparency so that you can allocate in the smartest way to the smartest individual and put that aside is what I feel we should be driving as a conversation. Because the perverse effect of focusing on a quota approach, a gender pure approach, is that I'm getting women coming to me, be my mentor. No, that's not how it works. It's not because I'm a woman, you're a woman, we're together, and it's not because you feel disadvantaged from the statistics we've showed that this is going to work the relationship. It's giving them the best tools, hard and soft skills, and then building them, proving themselves through the ecosystem. But it's really a question of representation. I'm able to say this because I'm a woman and I'm an LP in the sense that I can allocate capital. And so it's true, as a woman, I'm biased to understand women problems. So I am interested in allocating in industries that are completely underrepresented. And so it's kind of this virtuous cycle of just being confident that performance is driven by taking away the biases and being okay to take certain risks on the unknown, if we may say so, and figuring out how you can calculate those risks. And that will bring more diversity at all levels, from capital allocation to entrepreneurial opportunities. And we're seeing this shift move in a very positive way, I feel. And then there's policy. I mean, you can't beat policy sometimes, which makes the real shift.
Okay, thank you. I think it's, any time for a break, and you can even discuss it, during the break about complex topic. Thank you to the panelists, great panel. Thank you. Transferring the basement, in our innovation lab.